Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, Senator Kevin Cramer joins to take your listener questions. Remember, he's on the show every week. You can submit your questions anytime. Rob at sayanythingblog.com, or if you watch me on social media, you can find me, Rob Port, on Twitter or Facebook. I put up open threads where you can submit your questions there as well. But of course, not everybody wants their question necessarily to be public. Or to ask it in public, I guess, anyway. So if you want to email them to me, or that's more convenient to you, Rob at sayanythingblog.com. That's the way to go. But before we get to Senator Kevin Cramer, I want to do a little bit of a rant. This one on things in the North Dakota university system. Now, those of you who follow my work at sayanythingblog.com and following this podcast know I've been breaking some stories lately about the president at the University of North Dakota. It's a gentleman by the name of Mark Kennedy. He has made some hiring decisions that were a little bit questionable. He promoted his his special assistant, promoted her to chief of staff, gave her a $30,000 a year raise when she was on the way out the door, and then announced she was going to be working from Texas and would have an allowance of up to $25,000 a year to commute back and forth. Now, President Kennedy got called on the mat about that by the State Board of Higher Education. And oh, by the way, he also has been employing a longtime personal friend. He employed them for a time as the director of the Center for Innovation. This gentleman was collecting a salary north of $200,000, or it was over $17,000 a month. If you work that out into a year, it's north of $200,000 a year, which is about twice what the permanent predecessor was making. And oh, by the way, he also billed nearly $30,000 to commute from Boston to Grand Forks in order to do this job, which is a little silly. Why are we spending all of this money to fly people into Grand Forks? Aren't there people who live in Grand Forks or at least North Dakota who could do these jobs? Well, apparently not. But what's interesting is that this week, President Kennedy actually had a review due to the State Board of Higher Education. It was conducted by System Chancellor Mark Hagerott, and at least one member of the board wasn't necessarily happy with what they were seeing in the review, basically noting that the review didn't have any criticism or any feedback or that might be considered negative or what have you of President Kennedy at all. Now, those of us who watched the university system for a while understand what these evaluations are. They're just for show. The chancellors, it doesn't matter. The current chancellor, Mark Hagerott, previous chancellors, it doesn't really matter. None of them are really being all that candid in these evaluations because through controversy, through scandal, you never really see that reflected in the evaluations because the chancellors are reticent to ever put anything negative in there about the presidents. But what's interesting about this situation is that we have a chancellor who actually just came right out and said, hey, I don't feel like I could be candid in these evaluations. I'm not kidding you. That's a direct quote. I'm reading here. This is from a Grand Forks Herald article written by Sydney Mook. I'm going to quote from part of her article. She's talking about Chancellor Mark Hagerott and UND President Mark Kennedy. I quote, Hagerott said he has spoken with Kennedy about each of those issues. Additionally, he said there are written records of their discussions available for people to read via an open records request. Hagerott also offered to give more information to board members individually about verbal discussions he had with Kennedy. Now, here's the key quote. This is a direct quote from Chancellor Hagerott. I did not feel inclined that it would be helpful to be recording publicly candid comments about each of the situations in a written document. So what he's saying there essentially is I didn't want to be candid in writing in a document that's a public record. Now, what does that tell us about the governance of the university system in the state of North Dakota? The fact that the ostensible CEO of the system, the person who's in charge, the chancellor, who reports to the State Board of Higher Education and is in charge of overseeing the presidents at the various universities, overseeing the entire system, feels like he can't be candid in a written evaluation of his subordinates, the university presidents. For years, we've had a debate about how to govern the North Dakota university system. In fact, there's been a debate going on in Bismarck about it now. Governor Doug Burgum proposed a model that would have 3 boards, one for UND, one for NDSU and Fargo, and a third for the other 9 member institutions of the North Dakota university system, the other 9 public universities in our state. Yes, we have 11 in a state with just over 700,000 people. That's a whole other issue we can get into. But that was Governor Burgum's proposal. It's been shot down by the legislature, but the legislature is now talking about having an expanded board. Previously, the legislature had put on the statewide ballot a constitutional amendment to turn the State Board of Higher Education into a 3-member full-time commission. I mean, there's been a lot of going back to the higher ed roundtable in the 90s. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the governance structure of the universities for a long time. And I think the reason why is consistently, I think many in the public, including myself, don't feel like the people in the university system are all that accountable to anybody, right? There's nobody who's elected of the people who's directly in charge of the university system. In fact, a lot of people joke that it's sort of the fourth branch of government. You know, we have the judiciary, we have the executive branch, the governor, and then we have the legislature, and then, oh, hey, we have the university system too, which is not elected by anybody. They're appointed by the governor, but they don't work at the pleasure of the governor. The governor can't hire or fire anybody off the State Board of Higher Education at will. So it's just sort of this very, very large chunk of our state budget, an outsized chunk. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. It's a chunk of our state budget that, or hundreds of millions of dollars. I shouldn't say billions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars, everybody name. Sometimes it's cracked over $1 billion. It's a lot of money. And they really don't have a lot of oversight. I mean, they really don't. The presidents really aren't accountable to anybody. They certainly don't seem to be accountable to the chancellor because the chancellor is afraid of being candid in his criticism of them. Now, why would the chancellor of the university system be afraid of this? Well, the reason why is parochialism, right? Every university has, you know, this network of alumni around them. They have hometown lawmakers. They have hometown media, newspaper editorial boards. They have sports fans, right? You know, NDSU Bison football fans, UND hockey fans. And those people are very, very protective of their institutions to the point where, and I know this from personal experience, when you criticize one of these universities, they attack you. They come after you. And it's not always very pretty. And so the chancellor essentially has no constituencies. The university presidents have very powerful political and social constituencies. The chancellor really doesn't, and really neither does the State Board of Higher Education. Now, what was remarkable was when President Kennedy's problems, and by the way, the problems at UND aren't just his recent hiring decisions. The UND is actually on their third search for a dean of the UND Law School, a law school where the success rate for their graduates taking the bar is not all that great. There's low morale at UND. A lot of the faculty are upset. It's not a good situation. In fact, President Kennedy got into a spat with the Engelstad family, right? The Engelstad family, famously, you know, historically, this hugely important donor to the University of North Dakota, and here you have the president of the university getting into a public spat with him. It's been an ugly, ugly thing. And so there's a lot of problems at UND, but it seems like our board doesn't feel empowered to do anything about it. As a matter of fact, during a State Board of Higher Education meeting this week, at least two members of the board president Don Morton and another fellow board member, Kathy Nessett, basically said, well, you know, maybe there's problems here, but it's not really any of our business. And I got to ask, if a university president, if there's a question about whether or not he or she, as the case may be, is doing a good job, then whose responsibility is it other than the chancellor, who has told us that he doesn't feel like he could be candid in his evaluations of the university presidents, or the State Board of Higher Education, two members of which have said, well, you know, this isn't really our job. If it's not their job, whose job is it? Which again gets back to this governance debate. I don't know that the problem with the university system is the way the governance is structured around the universities. I think a lot of the problem is just the people. I would like to see a governance model that's ultimately accountable to somebody who's elected of the people. Now, a lot of people look away at that. They say that that's going to be politicizing the system. I would challenge you to argue that the university system could get any more political than it already is. I think that's a ridiculous argument. But at some point, the buck's got to stop somewhere. And I think that's the problem in the university system, is the buck isn't stopping anywhere. It's just around and around. Nobody really feels like they have any responsibility. Nobody really wants to take any responsibility. And then what we get are a bunch of very powerful, very ego-driven, bureaucratic, highly paid administrators kind of just doing whatever they want and really only kind of being restrained in by public opinion. And that, my friends, I think is a real problem. Senator Kevin Cramer, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me, as he does every week, to take your questions. Remember, you can submit questions for these weekly segments anytime. You can send them to rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'll save them up, and when he's on, I'll ask him. I also put up open threads on Facebook and Twitter, so if you want to try to ask that way, you certainly can. Senator, how are you?
I'm excellent, Rob. Thank you.
Over in your neck of the woods, well, I guess not your neck of the where you work, in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
Everybody's at Twitter about this testimony of Mr. Michael Cohen before the House Oversight Committee. What are you seeing? What? I mean, I realize this is like happening live, and I don't know how much of it it's happening in the chamber that you do not belong to anymore. So I'm not sure how much of this you've even seen. But what do you have any reaction at this point?
What I make of it? Well, it's sort of interesting because I haven't seen much of it. I've seen maybe 10 minutes of the whole thing, and the reason I saw that was because I was we had two votes today, and between the votes, or while we're waiting for everybody to vote, I watched a little bit of it in the cloakroom in the Senate, and it was pretty uneventful. That at least the 10 minutes or so I saw. Beyond that, I haven't seen a thing about it, of course, and it's not unusual. Of course, we're all in our own hearings and briefings and meetings, and so unless you're a member of the committee that's actually doing the questioning, you oftentimes have to see the highlights later or watch the whole thing. So, what I make of it is it's there's a lot. To me, it's a lot to do about nothing, but we'll see. I don't know what he's saying or dropping. I think everything he has to say is going to be filtered through the lens of somebody who's already, admitted to lying to Congress. So it does hurt his credibility. Obviously, that doesn't mean that some of what he's saying isn't true. It just means that it'll always be run through that sort of filter. The other thing is, I know that one of the issues surrounds evidently this $35,000 or whatever it is that he gets paid, or he was getting paid in form of a check from the president to pay off a woman. It seems like writing a check is a funny thing to do to cover up a crime, but so I have this sort of on the surface doubts about the guy's credibility all the way around. But beyond that, I just don't know much about what's happening.
Speaking about that, and again, I don't know how much of this you've seen, but your colleague, our fellow North Dakotan, Kelly Armstrong, getting a lot of attention for his questioning, and he really grilled Cohen on two fronts. Part of it was the finances and reporting things to taxes. In fact, I think Kelly's sort of parting shot was it exhausting keeping track of all these lies you were telling? That was his parting shot. But one thing that he said was, you recorded your clients. And he said, not only did you record your clients, but at the drop of a hat, somebody on this committee asked for it, and you're willing to just turn over recordings of your own clients, no question. And obviously, making the unethical. I think one thing that Kelly said is, I know lawyers who would go to jail before they would do something like that. So I think that was Kelly's sort of questioning of Mr. Cohen's credibility, in that front. Why? I think the larger question is, why were you recording all your clients?
Well, that's been a problem since it was first revealed that, but we already know we're not dealing with the most ethical lawyer in the bar. And, this is always going to be his problem. Now, as like I said, I don't want to prejudge everything he says and to presume that it's a lie, but you can't presume it's the truth. And, this is why it's always difficult when you bring snitches in, or if they the cops get a confession out of one person to get a bigger fish. All of those things, I think, in many respects, raise the question of just how investigations are done and how evidence is gathered. How the validity of anybody's testimony has to always be filtered through. But I'm not surprised Kelly did well. I heard he did well. I didn't see it. I did hear from a couple of people in the hallway. They were pretty proud of the job Kelly did. I'm not at all surprised by it. He's on the committees he's on because he's an effective litigator, and those are not, those are few. That's a skill. That's a skill set, right? That's few and far between. And to have somebody like Kelly on both the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee is very valuable to the institution.
I was laughing at the people on social media who were talking about how Kelly was like shaking or whatever, and I like if you know Kelly Arms, he's just a kinetic guy. Like that's just how he was. Yep. He's not nervous or anything. Yep. It's just, in fact, I was telling somebody that one of my favorite parts of watching Kelly in the state Senate was watching himself get endlessly entangled in his microphone cord on the floor during his floor speeches. Was one of my favorite parts. Now some of the things Cohen is saying is that, he's accusing Trump of being a racist, a cheat, a con man. I mean, at this point, I mean, we've heard those leveled against Donald Trump all the time, but I mean, this is his lawyer, and he's out there throwing these claims out there. Have you? I mean, does that jibe with your experience with Mr. Trump?
Well, not with mine. He's always been very straight up with me on a personal level, and he's always delivered when I've needed things that he was able to deliver on. And I haven't asked him for much, obviously, but he was helpful in my campaign, of course, because he recruited me heavily, and then he was as helpful as he needed to be. And I've always found him to be a straight up guy. So I've never seen that in him. It is interesting though. I was thinking as you were running down those lists of descriptions of I was thinking, well, there's like 16 other Republicans that ran for president against him. It's those same things about him. And he ended up being our nominee, ultimately, of course, the president of the United States. So I sense a fatigue in the American public, or at least the North Dakota public, over all of this stuff. What's interesting to me, Rob, and I think in some respects, unfortunate, again, I don't want to dismiss the importance of these investigations necessarily, but I also think that it does speak to sort of an out-of-touch media in Washington, D.C. that puts this as the live shot all day long, if you will, while other things that are going on, like negotiating with Kim Jong-un in the second round of the second summit over denuclearization, or the potential of it, or at least the goal of it, of the Korean Peninsula. Not a small matter when you see what's going on in terms of progress with China and in the trade deal and the tariffs and how all of that's going. Those are pretty consequential and pretty important. And you don't have to agree with all of it. I mean, in fact, I've found it amusing in the last week or so that the Democrats now who were against the tariffs and thought that Trump was reckless in the trade war with China are now criticizing him for appearing to be willing to accept less than everything that they should be getting from China. And I'm thinking, well, first of all, I don't sense that at all, and second of all, which side of this issue are you on? So to me, there's a lot of important big things going on, and not to mention, by the way, an emergency declaration that we're having a pretty serious debate about in the Senate right now, related to, of course, the southern border. So to me, those are much higher priorities than Michael Cohen's testimony before a House committee. Well,
last question about President Trump and Michael Cohen. I suspect a lot of the listeners hearing you defend President Trump are going to say, well, of course, Kevin Cramer's defending Donald Trump. They're friends, they're political allies. They're both Republicans. So this is just Republicans battening down the hatches and standing by their man. And just like Democrats do with one of theirs, and it's just politics as usual. What do you say to people who are mounting that sort of criticism?
Sure. Well, I'd say people who are mounting that sort of criticism are simply being critical because they can't accept that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. But I want to be clear. I'm not dismissing everything that Michael Cohen says. I'm just saying that I think everybody has to run it through the filter that recognizes that this is a guy who's already admitted to lying to Congress, and now he's talking to Congress, and you just sort of have to wonder, when's he lying, when's he not lying, and it's up to both sides to grill him and to question him and cross-examine him, and the American public will draw their conclusions as well as the committee itself. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of other important things that are going on that I think are much more consequential than Michael Cohen's testimony before a House committee.
Speaking about the other things that are going on, President Trump, obviously in North Korea, high-stakes negotiations, not least because the people that we're negotiating with are notoriously unreliable.
Right.
How does the president get something out of this? I mean, first of all, how do you feel it's going? And second of all, how do we get something out of North Korea that we can trust?
Well, you'll always have to verify anything that they claim to be giving you, and that's why we have spy satellites. That's why you try to have as much intel as you can. Although North Korea really is a blank spot in a lot of intel gathering, because they've done such a great job of just putting their thumb on the entire country and going dark. Really, as you know, a lot of their testing is done underground. There's just lots of ways that they've prevented. Good spying even. So you never really know, Rob. But I do know this much, that if we weren't putting the kind of pressure on them that Donald Trump is, if we didn't have the type of massive coalition, really, and I think this is one of the things that's underappreciated, that our administration, this administration, the United States has put together a pretty strong coalition, including China to varying degrees. China is the one that has the most influence over the Kim regime and in North Korea. And they've been somewhat helpful in applying pressure to North Korea. So, having them at the table, realizing that, again, there's a lot going on that we wish wasn't going on, but there's less going on than there was before Donald Trump became president, put this kind of pressure on, and before he started having summits with Kim Jong-un, and before Kim Jong-un walked across the border into South Korea at historic moments, before they released our hostages, before they released the remains of American soldiers from the Korean War. I mean, these are all things that were not happening under previous presidents that are happening today. And so if we don't achieve full denuclearization, which is the goal, every day that they're not firing missiles or testing missiles is a better day than if they were. So I think we have to manage our expectations appropriately.
Got a question now from Twitter from Luke. He says, given Trump's recent success in getting China to purchase massive amounts of U.S. agricultural products, do you now feel that your public anti-tariff position during the 2018 campaign may have been incorrect? In other words, was Trump right and were you wrong?
Well, I don't know that they've ordered massive amounts of agricultural products yet. I hope they do. I want them to, of course. I think that I'm not a tariff fan. I think, tariffs are paid by the consumer. They're not paid by the country that you put the tariffs on. But it certainly has expedited China's economic downturn, which I think is part of what brings them to the table. I don't think there's any question about that. But the recent purchase of soybeans, for example, was I think it was something like a third of what they normally order in the course of a year. So we're still a long ways from where they usually are. I'm hoping we get there. I really am. But again, that's not to say that I think my position on tariffs was wrong. I think the president is absolutely right to apply pressure and economic pressure and coalition pressure when we can. I'd like to have seen more of a coalition in support of this, but I do wish him well, and I have stood by his decision. It wouldn't have been the way I'd have gone. But I also have been very clear, and was throughout the campaign, that regardless of my personal position on tariffs, once he made that decision to go that route, I wanted to see him see it through to success for American farmers and businesses, and of course our national security. One thing, Rob, I can tell you that this president understands is how bad an actor China is. And there are a lot of people who I think they see them as a market of 1.5 billion people, and that's not unimportant. But this is an autocratic regime that is committed to spreading that form of government throughout the world, and they're doing it in many ways, not the least of which is through stealing our technology and unfair pressure on American businesses to reveal technology and intellectual property, as well as building, as you know, these artificial islands in the South China Sea. They're building a massive navy and military, and they're spreading a lot of generosity and goodwill throughout other parts of the world where there's voids for influence. And they make no bones about their desire to be world dominant. So we can't take our eye off of it. And that means that we have to use all of the tools in the tool chest, and the president's doing exactly that.
Via Twitter, someone going by the handle Cinnamon Girl asks, what is Cramer's schedule for in-person town halls around North Dakota in 2019? This does not include newspaper interviews, podcasts, radio, or webinars.
Sure. So we are working on that schedule right now. We probably won't have a 2019 schedule. It's more the kind of thing that we will schedule month by month as we look at what days I'll be back in the state. We generally have a week during a federal holiday that involves state work week, as we call it, that would provide some of those opportunities. And so we've been talking about just this week about the week when I'm back in March. There's a few days in March that I'm in the state where I might want to hold some coffee with Cramers, because that's what we want to do is go back to the coffee with Cramer format. Now, I will say though, and I know she doesn't want to include the other modes of communication, but those are also very important. And we're actually doing more radio than we've ever done, than I ever did in the house. And so that's going to continue to be an important way to communicate, as well as coffee with Cramer.
Jay Thomas is on the Facebook thread asking how you thought Congressman Kelly Armstrong did in the Cohen hearing, and I think we've established he did good.
Yeah.
Let's see, I got a couple of questions. Two people asking the same thing. Carolyn emailed, "Hi, Rob, do you know or can you find out why Senator Cramer missed the vote today? Awful that he didn't make his position clear on cloture on the Born Alive Protection Act." And then Tim Knutson on Facebook asked the same thing. Why didn't he vote on the Born Alive bill?
Yeah. So first of all, the first one was right. It was a cloture vote. It wasn't on final passage of the bill, of course. And a cloture vote means you have to get 60 votes. The reason I missed it, and Senator Tim Scott, another person who missed the vote, had nothing to do with our lack of support for it. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill. And on my very first floor speech in the United States Senate was in support of pro-life positions. But what it was a flight on Monday got hung up in Minneapolis, actually, the plane that comes into Bismarck that then goes back to Minneapolis before making a connection and going to Washington, D.C. That plane ended up being about 3+ hours late. And so I was unable. Tim, of course, coming from the southeastern part of the country, not the Midwest, had the same exact problem, missing the connection and then not getting until about 4 hours, 4 hours after the vote had taken place. Now, the good news, of course, is this. And by the way, it's been widely reported, including in some of the pro-life groups have reported Tim's and my reason for missing the vote. But as he and I discussed at lunch today, there have been 58 votes, and the two of us weren't there yet with bad weather or flight delays. The vote would have been held open, so we could have been number 59 and number 60 and brought that vote up to the floor. I even tweeted about the vote coming up prior to it being voted on, and I think I tweeted on it after it was voted on, one or the other or both. But my position on it is very, very clear. Of course, I have a 100% pro-life voting record, and all of the pro-life groups know that and know it well. And like I said, it was pretty widely reported at least in the Washington media, why Senator Scott and I missed that vote.
Jason asks via Facebook, why did we need a constitutional amendment to outlaw alcohol? Why does the federal government think they don't require a constitutional amendment to outlaw cannabis? And I think his argument there is, I think he's drawing a comparison between the two. When we banned alcohol, we amended the Constitution, but marijuana is currently prohibited and there's no constitutional amendment. So I think that's his question.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that historical part of it. I do know that there's a Controlled Substances Act, which covers lots of things. I mean, if the Constitution doesn't explicitly outlaw something, that doesn't mean that laws can't be passed to outlaw it. If the Constitution doesn't guarantee something, that would be a different standard. So in other words, if the Constitution guaranteed your right to alcohol or guaranteed your right to cannabis, obviously that would be a different standard than than statute that is designed, albeit, by the way, usually an overreach, but designed for the common good, which is what our founders created an opportunity for legislatures to do. I will say this, that most things that are made illegal, or every rule, regulation, law beyond the first 10, pretty much have been the reaction, and oftentimes an overreaction to some abuse of something that was otherwise legal. it does seem to me that we could start turning back some of those things, which is why this president's been so active in rolling back lots of regulations that, again, there might have been an initial appropriate intent in certain things, but as is often the case, it's often an overreaction.
I suspect that the federal government's authority comes from the Interstate Commerce Clause. That seems to be things that not, because otherwise, if it's not delegated, the 10th Amendment says if it's not delegated to Congress or the federal government, it goes to the states, which makes me wonder why marijuana just can't be a state's issue. Anyway.
Well, and I think it is, and that's what, as you know, that's always been the position I've supported. I'm not a big legalized marijuana guy, but I do think that I do believe that's right. And interstate commerce is one of those things that can get in and of itself get murky, as you know. But at any rate, I agree. I think it should be a states' rights issue.
Final question: Matthew asks, Star Trek or Star Wars?
That's funny because I've never been a big Star Wars guy. It's not that I'm against Star Wars, but I loved the original Star Trek with Leonard Nimoy, of course, and Captain James Kirk. So that was my youth, I guess, that's showing more than anything. So I'm a Star Trek guy.
Star Trek guy. All right. Well, that's our answer. Yeah. Kevin, thanks for your time as always.
Always my pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday. If you want to subscribe, you can find us on your favorite podcasting platform. Just search for Plain Talk with Rob Port. If you ever have any problems with the podcast, it's not sounding great, I'll admit it's a little bit of a trial and error process on my side. I'm learning as I go. Never done this before. Just kind of trying things and seeing what works. But I want to make sure it's a good experience for you. So if you're having problems or you want to give feedback on something I talked about on the show, you want to write sort of a letter to the editor type thing to me, you want to have a question for Senator Cramer or Congressman Armstrong when they're on every week, use Rob at sayanythingblog.com for that. Also, follow me on social media. You can find me on Facebook. I'm just Rob Port on there. Say Anything Blog has a Facebook page as well. And also on Twitter, Rob Port, Say Anything Blog. Find me there as well. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.